Have you ever heard a clock chime when it shouldn't have? Not part of any schedule, not marking any real hour, but instead sounding like a signal, a warning, a whisper from the past that something was never laid to rest. This isn't the kind of story where everything is as it seems. It's a tale stitched together from forgotten memories, locked doors, and a single flower too carefully hidden to be innocent. If you believe time heals all wounds, listen closely, because after this story, you may never trust the sound of a chime again. The funeral of Miss Evelina Harrowfield carried with it an air not just of solemnity, but of something unspoken, something old and unsettled, like dust stirred from forgotten corners. And though the ceremony at St. Agnes Hollow was proper and quiet, its stillness carried a different weight, as though the village itself held its breath. The chapel, with ivy-choked windows, and centuries-old benches polished by generations of grief, echoed faintly with whispers not spoken but felt. For Miss Harrowfield, the last flicker of an extinguished lineage, had been more ghost than neighbor in her final years, seldom seen, vaguely remembered, and yet always present like a draught in a closed room. Those who sat in the pews now, neighbors, curious strangers, and a few stiff-backed relatives, did so less from mourning, and more from the pull of uneasy obligation. And among them, quietly and sharply observant as ever, sat Miss Verity Elmscroft, gloved hands resting atop a worn black purse, eyes scanning not just the altar, but the souls gathered around it. Verity, who had journeyed to Greystone Vale, merely to assist her cousin after surgery, now found herself drawn into a far stranger operation, the slow dissection of a death that felt too neat. Evelina, they said, had died peacefully in her armchair, with a half-finished letter to a solicitor resting on her lap, and a long cold cup of valerian tea at her side. But it was not the manner of her death that disturbed, rather the moment the vicar began the final prayer, when the ancient tower clock above them did something no one could explain. It struck not 12, but 13. A single unmistakable, deliberate 13th chime rang through the nave like the exhale of a buried secret. The congregation froze, not in panic, but in something heavier, older. A few crossed themselves, others stared skyward, as though the answer might be hiding in the eaves. No one spoke of it aloud, but every glance carried the echo of that uninvited bell, and Verity, trained more by instinct than experience, noticed everything. The way the vicar hesitated before resuming, the way Evelina's nephew gripped his cuff too tightly, and most of all, the way Mr. Alder Crick the clockkeeper, thin as wire, and smelling faintly of grease and tobacco, had gone pale and stiff at the sound, his gaze snapping to the belfry with the dread of a man who had feared this day for years. He stood near the back, not with the mourners, not apart either, his face crumpling momentarily before he vanished altogether into the drizzle, before the service had even ended. That night, as wind rattled the panes and Verity sat with her cousin sipping tea and processing the day, she remarked, with the same casual precision she used to describe weather or garden pests, that a man entrusted with a church clock for 42 years would never allow it to chime 13, unless it had been meant to. And so began the real ceremony, not of burial, but of quiet, persistent questioning. Rumors of an estranged goddaughter, who had vanished after a single visit last spring, a nurse dismissed in haste weeks before Evelina's death, after asking too many questions, and letters, so many letters, allegedly burned in the drawing-room hearth the day before the solicitor was expected. A maid mentioned strange footprints, once seen outside the cellar door, and the butcher's wife swore Evelina had spoken of a visitor no one else had ever seen. Officially, it remained heart failure. But Greystone Vale, as villagers do, preferred its own truth, layered, unsettling, and whispered beneath the breath, and Verity Elmscroft, quietly folding the memory of that 13th chime into her mental tapestry, knew the true story had only just begun to tick. Mr. Thaddeus Grieve's funeral was steeped in a strange chill, a suffocating kind of calm, as though time itself had paused, unwilling to move forward. It wasn't overly grand, nor entirely modest. Yet what unsettled most was the eerie stillness that seemed to coat every breath. St. Elfrida's Chapel, long abandoned, with ivy crawling up its stone walls like sorrow that had lingered for decades, felt disturbingly alive that day. The air held the scent of old books and forgotten dust, and the distant toll of the crematorium bell suddenly tore through the silence like a blade. Just as the vicar began the final prayer, the chapel's old bell, silent since 1912, according to local law, suddenly rang once, then again, then a third and fourth time, each chime louder, sharper, almost deliberate, as if struck by an unseen hand. When it rang for the 13th time, every face turned pale, drained as though someone had reached inside and stolen the warmth from their bones. Miss Agnes Bellamy, seated at the very back with gloved hands clasping a small black diary, didn't flinch once. Her eyes held no surprise, no fear, only a quiet, unwavering gaze, as if she'd long been waiting for this exact moment. Her journey to St. Elfrida's wasn't accidental. She had come because of an old journal her grandfather had left behind, a cryptic entry scribbled in a corner. Greaves hid something, and one day time will speak it aloud. 2 days after the funeral, the chapel caretaker's young son Milo returned to retrieve his forgotten torch, only to discover a small wooden box tucked behind the altar. It bore Greaves' personal seal, and was tied with an aged silk ribbon. On the lid, faded ink spelled out, "To be opened when time forgets itself." Inside lay a yellowed envelope, and a haunting photograph of a young boy standing before a burned-down manor, his eyes hollow, drained of hope, as though life had long since abandoned him. When the village solicitor, Mr. Cranwell, who had managed Greaves' affairs for years, unsealed the new will, gasps echoed in the room. The old will, which had left the estate to the Historical Society and the church's roof fund, had been revoked. A single name now replaced it: Miss Alara Vale. No one had ever heard of her, yet buried deep within the 1897 parish records was her name, marked deceased at birth. 3 days later, Alara arrived, a tall woman with a pale face, her tattered coat carrying a strange ancient scent, and around her neck hung a locket bearing the same sigil etched onto the sealed box. She claimed to remember nothing, had never met Thaddeus Greaves, and yet when shown the boy's photograph, she spoke just one line: "I remember the window," and fell silent for the rest of the day. The village buzzed with whispers. Was Alara truly the rightful heir, or had an old tale begun to rise again from the grave? Miss Bellamy quietly examined the will. The parchment was onion skin thin, a rare type discontinued after 1923, suggesting it was either extraordinarily old or meticulously replicated. Mr. Cranwell's hand trembled, but only once, and it was when he read Alara's name aloud. That tremble wasn't due to legal uncertainty. It was something deeper, something remembered. That evening, Miss Bellamy sat alone on a pew behind the altar, the dying sun filtering through stained glass as if watching her. She whispered softly, "Time never forgets. It only waits to see who remembers." And that night, long after the village had fallen asleep, the chapel bell tolled again, soft, distant and deliberate. No one spoke of it the next day. Perhaps some heard it, perhaps some didn't, but those who did said nothing. Some secrets are only meant for those willing to carry their weight. The reading of Lady Oriana Vale's will took place not in a modern solicitor's office, but in the shadowed drawing room of Blackmere House, a place suspended somewhere between decay and dignity, where the wallpaper curled at the edges, and the chandelier above flickered as though disturbed by something unseen. Rain tapped lightly at the tall mullioned windows, as if trying to listen in. Among those present was a man unknown to most, tall, lean, with a scholar's posture, and the kind of stillness that draws attention by avoiding it. He introduced himself as Dorian Vale, speaking in tones too precise, each syllable balanced like a coin on edge, the kind of careful diction one uses when hiding something under the surface of truth. No childhood memories were offered, only the soft-spoken invocation of a name, Oriana, with such restrained reverence it seemed to echo from a deeper place than speech. He claimed to have been raised abroad, yet wore cufflinks bearing the original Vale crest, discontinued after the war, and on his left shoe Miss Halberd, a quiet woman with a memory trained by years of cataloguing parish history, noted a cobbler's stamp last seen in Devon before 1935. Aldwych, the family's solicitor for over 30 years, unfolded the brittle parchment of the new will. His voice trembled, but not from age. The clause naming Dorian as heir referred to him not by name, but as the true child beneath the bell, a phrase no one questioned aloud, but which sent a visible ripple through the room. The bell tower had long been sealed, ever since the spring of '29 when a servant's child had been found dead at its base, unbaptized and unnamed. It was never spoken of directly, only whispered in fragments, how the bell had tolled on its own during the storm, how Lady Oriana had not attended the funeral, how afterward the nursery in the west wing was boarded shut. Dorian toured the house like a man, seeing something remembered through fog, pausing not at portraits or heirlooms, but in odd places. A cracked tile in the scullery, the cold hearth in the music room, the iron key still hanging behind the pantry door. At the parlor, he stopped beneath the empty brass hook, where once Lady Oriana's own portrait had hung. She removed it herself, murmured Mrs. Ellery, the long-time housekeeper. Her voice barely audible, said the eyes no longer recognized her. Her hands trembled slightly as she straightened the antimacassar, and Miss Halberd saw the faint bruising at her wrist, the shape of fingers too large to be her own. Later that night, while sorting through parish registers by candlelight, Miss Halberd found an entry from 1909. Dorian Vale, male infant stillborn. The line was drawn through in red, overwritten in the same shaky hand that had composed Oriana's final letters, one of which was hidden in a volume of forgotten cryptography in her private library. It ended with only this: some inherit blood, others inherit silence, but silence always remembers. And when the house fell quiet once more, the great iron bell of Blackmere, silent for decades, gave a single mournful toll, though no rope had moved, and no wind stirred the air. They said the portrait was taken down in silence, and that was already strange. For silence in a house like Tarrowmore was never truly silent. It breathed in the walls, creaked in the beams, and muttered in the radiators. No one saw Lavanna remove it. One day it was there, a striking oil painting of a young man in military uniform, with intelligent eyes and a crooked smile, that seemed to know things no one else did. The next it was gone. No explanation, no replacement, only the faint square of cleaner wallpaper where the frame had once cast its shadow, and a hook that now hung useless and accusing above the fireplace. At first glance, it seemed a minor alteration, but in houses built on inheritance and silence, a missing portrait isn't just forgotten, it's buried. Erasure, when done by the hands of family, becomes an act of quiet violence. Mrs. Whitcomb, the housekeeper who'd served since before the war, only spoke of it once, late in the kitchen as rain pattered against the windows and steam curled around the teacups. She said, more to the sugar jar than to Miss Darnley, she always wound that old clock herself, even after the left eye failed. It was an offhand remark, but Miss Darnley froze mid-sip. The study clock, a monstrous thing of dark walnut and brass with a lion's head key, was one of Lavanna's peculiar obsessions. She didn't trust anyone else to touch it, not the staff, not her late husband, not even Mr. Fernley, the solicitor who knew more of her affairs than her own son. She snapped at me once, Whitcomb added, like I'd poured ink on her memories, said, time has to be wound with care. But what kind of care? Miss Darnley wondered. What kind of time required guardianship so fierce it bordered on ritual? Winding a clock, after all, is mechanical, but guarding it like a secret is psychological. Later that evening, under the pretext of checking her shawl, Miss Darnley drifted to the study. The door, unusually, was ajar. The room felt paused. The brandy decanter sat on the sideboard, its stopper askew, as though someone had lifted it mid-thought, and then forgotten what they were doing. There was a scent in the air, faint, almost floral, but sharp at the edges like something artificial trying to mimic nature. On the armchair by the writing desk, slumped like a marionette with cut strings, was Mr. Fernley. His eyes stared at nothing, lips curled in a frozen sneer, or was it disappointment? His hand hung down, fingertips grazing the carpet. No sign of struggle, no note, no overturned furniture, only stillness. It was Julian who found him, pale as the linen curtains behind him, and claimed he'd come to collect tax papers left the day before. He insisted the front door had been unlocked when he arrived, a detail that raised eyebrows, for the lock was always turned twice at night, a ritual Lavanna never forgot. Only 5 people had keys to Taramore: Julian, newly named heir, Mrs. Whitcomb, though her hand now trembled when she held one, Miss Darnley, whose key never left the silver chain around her neck, the old gardener, deaf and near mute, and Lavanna herself. But Lavanna was not in her room, nor in the conservatory, nor even on the grounds. She was found hours later, in the south wing corridor, seated at the base of the stairs in a state of near catatonia, hands streaked with something sticky and faintly red, jam, they first assumed, but it wasn't sweet. Beneath the study clock, behind a panel only accessible by removing the baseboard with the lion's head key, Miss Darnley discovered a hidden cavity. Inside was a worn leather-bound ledger, full of handwritten notes, entries not in Mr. Fernley's immaculate script, but in a shakier, more erratic hand. The final page had been torn out violently, but etched into the wood beneath, as if by a desperate fingertip or something sharper, were 3 words. Time saw everything. It was then that Miss Darnley understood. The portrait hadn't just been removed. It had been hidden because someone needed him gone, even in memory. Not forgotten, but silenced. And whatever Miss Fernley had discovered in those final hours, it had cost him not just his life, but the illusion of order that Lavanna had so carefully constructed around the ticking of an old lion-headed clock. They said the 5th key had never been officially recorded. No signature in the estate ledger, no brass tag with a name, no rightful claim traced to it. Just a half-forgotten remark, whispered once on a brittle December afternoon over a too generous pour of wine. Lord Avemore, flushed from the drink and weary of politics, had let it slip during a rambling toast, something about the one no one speaks of, because it's safer that way. Most had chuckled or dismissed it as noble eccentricity, but not Miss Verity. She, quiet in the corner with her tea cooling in its cup, had tilted her head just slightly, filing the words away behind her patient eyes. That was her gift. Not the kind that made headlines or moved crowds, but the quiet, watchful kind that waited for years if needed, until everything others missed began to shimmer under its gaze. There were 4 official keys. Verity's own, held from her years as archivist and companion. The groundskeeper's always hung by the door on a dull iron hook. The late Elsbeth's found among her drowned effects, and the vicar's which he had returned solemnly after the fire, wrapped in a scrap of altar cloth, as if it still carried sin. All accounted for. But the fifth had never been seen, only implied, only feared. It had always been rumored to exist, forged quietly in an age when duplicity was not yet disgraceful, but essential, when locked rooms were as much for privacy as they were for protection. When Dr. Penfold was discovered in the library, slumped gently at his desk, spectacles hanging crooked from his nose, a faint, strange smile drawn across his lips, it might have seemed a gentle end, a man exhausted by a lifetime of secrets, slipping away with the rain. The window was shut, the latch undisturbed, the thick sill bore no smudge of entry, no disruption to the fragile veil of dust that time had woven there. Outside, the drizzle had whispered against the panes all night, but not a single wet footprint graced the marble floor, nothing broken, nothing missing, except the man himself, stilled as if in mid-thought. The decanter of port rested on the desk's left corner, its stopper missing. Verity noted it immediately. The absence was too exact, too deliberate. And the scent in the air, at first oddly pleasant, carried beneath its sweetness a bitterness that clawed at the edges of memory. Aniseed, lavender, and aconite. Wolfsbane, a killer that moved quiet as breath, that slowed the heart without a cry, wrapped in a perfume of ancient remedies and old gardens. She had known that smell once, in a village long buried by time, where a widow had made tinctures behind drawn curtains and whispered too much to her cat. Verity didn't say it aloud. Not yet. The servants gave their statements with that clipped mechanical grief one wears in polite tragedy. Mrs. Halford, always trembling, wrung her hands till they blushed. Denby, hollow-eyed and pale, spoke only when pressed. But it was Miss Cairn, the companion, whose voice broke through the silence like a cold wind under a closed door. He had secrets, she said. The kind that stain even in fire. Verity felt those words nestle somewhere deep beneath her ribs. Unwelcome but unmistakable. When the house was searched again, not for valuables, but for understanding, Verity found herself drawn to the study, not by logic, but by something older, a pull like the hush before a storm. And there, behind a false panel lined with old ledgers and patient accounts, was a set of folded papers, not notes to the doctor, but from him. Apologies. Regrets. Confessions etched in a slanted hand that faltered near the end. There were names, debts, and one letter marked with no recipient. Only a date. 1 week before Elsbeth drowned. It read, "I burned the letters like you asked, but you cannot burn memory. That, I fear, remains." Verity read it again. And again, her fingers growing colder with each line. If Penfold had known of Elsbeth's fate, if he had helped conceal something darker, why write this now? Why leave it where it could be found? And most terrifying, who else had known? The fifth key wasn't just about access. It was permission, a silent invitation that someone had used, not to take, not to steal, but to erase, not clumsily, but with surgical precision, as if clearing rot from a root without disturbing the bloom above. This wasn't a singular act of violence, Verity understood then. It was a sequence, each death a link in a chain that had been forged long ago, and only now begun to tighten. Someone, clever, quiet, without remorse, was pulling those links still. And Verity, heart hammering beneath her calm exterior, knew with a cold certainty. She had not read the last page yet. Not by far. The grandfather clock in the East Hall had not merely stopped. It had fallen into a deliberate silence, as if the very notion of time had been forbidden to pass within those walls. Not through accident, nor the slow failure of gears, but with intent so quiet, so calculated, that only someone attuned to the subtleties of unease might have noticed. The pendulum, the quiet heart of time's breath, had been removed not with haste, but reverence, and its absence left behind a void more chilling than the tick it once offered. To most it was nothing, a harmless detail, overlooked, forgotten. But to Helena Vexley, who saw significance in silence and instinct in stillness, it was a whisper of something withheld. She lingered in that hallway longer than the others, standing with the composure of someone listening not for noise, but for the memory of rhythm, the pulse of the manor that had once beat steady and unbroken. That silence, artificial and taut, was not the absence of sound but the presence of suppression, and within that void, Helena sensed something ancient and unsettled, crouched just behind the wallpaper of perception. Her attention drifted to the writing desk, once the sanctuary of Lady Morena, the manor's long-deceased matron, whose presence still clung to corners and window panes like smoke. Under the pretense of organizing old correspondences for the estate's cataloguing, Helena gently peeled back the faded velvet lining of the bottom drawer. The wood beneath was warped and reluctant, yet it yielded, revealing a hidden compartment, crafted with a precision meant to evade time's erosion. Inside lay a once elegant ribbon, its blue now faded into the bruised shade of memory, coiled tightly around a parchment so fragile it seemed it might sigh to dust at any moment. Stamped upon it was a symbol, a falcon in mid-flight, wings flared, not inked but pressed, as if heat-sealed by a hand that knew secrecy. The parchment reeked faintly of cedar, and something acrid, bitter and alchemical, saltpeter perhaps, or old gunpowder, as though the note had passed through fire without being consumed. Helena unfolded it carefully. The words within, etched in a hand both sharp and breathless, read, "Do not let him turn the key again." The house remembers. There was no name, no date, only the threat of memory coiled within its warning. Behind it, almost as an afterthought, a second scrap was wedged, torn hastily from a leather-bound journal, the corner scorched and curled. It spoke cryptically of a second threshold, a door at the far edge of the cellar, one that had not appeared in any blueprint or estate record. Sealed, it claimed, long before Helena had drawn her first breath. When Helena later approached Mrs. Daltrey, the housekeeper, with gentle curiosity, the older woman offered only the rehearsed calm of someone accustomed to burying questions beneath manners. "There's no such door, miss," she said with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. But when Helena mentioned the old wine crypt, Mrs. Daltrey's hands faltered against the tea tray, just a tremble, a clink of china, but enough to betray her. "Hasn't been opened since the flood of '61, she muttered, far too quickly. And yet when Helena descended into the basement 2 nights later, oil lantern in hand and heartbeat steady with fear, she found the lock on that crypt door bore fresh gouges, tiny, recent, unmistakable. It was Mr. Thorne, the estate's ancient groundskeeper, who finally broke the hush of the past. By the fireside, after enough mulled cider had loosened his tongue and dulled the weight of loyalty, he admitted, in a voice cracked and barely audible, there was another child long ago, a boy, said to be unwell. But he wasn't. He was different. Heard things the rest of us didn't, said the walls whispered, even when he slept. Helena didn't press further. She didn't need to. The crypt door yielded on the third try, rust screaming in protest as it opened inward. The air that hit her was not cold in the ordinary sense. It had weight, it had will, and it coiled around her as though testing her presence. Inside, there were no shelves of wine, no catalogued vintage, only rough-hewn stone, veined with moisture, and scrawled across the far wall in faded Latin, a message as chilling as prophecy. Temporis est veraces. Time is truth. At the room's center stood a rusted cot, its mattress gutted, stuffing spilling out like straw beneath slaughter, and there, suspended on a lone bent nail above it, hung the pendulum. Unmarked, untouched, yet unmistakably the one missing from the whole clock. Helena did not cry out. Instead, she stepped back, slow, measured, as the thick air seemed to inhale around her. This was not a cellar, it was a sanctum. A chamber not meant to store wine or tools, but memory itself. Memory preserved, restrained, and now disturbed. When she returned upstairs, dawn beginning to gnaw at the windows, she passed the grandfather clock in the east hall, and heard it ticking, soft, steady, alive. It had not been repaired. It had been awakened. The key had turned, as the note had warned. The house had remembered, and somewhere deep within its walls, it had begun to speak again. On a wind-hushed October afternoon, as stormlight bruised the distant moors and the chimneys of Hollowfield Manor exhaled soft smoke into the chilled air, the long-forgotten name Clara Merrick rose not from any document or obituary, but from the trembling lips of Miss Beatrice Langley, once governess to the Farrow children, now frail and half lost to time, in a care home whose windows gazed eastward toward a land of heather, secrets and fog. She danced differently, you know, Beatrice had whispered, her brittle hands working invisible threads into her shawl, her eyes distant, half-glazed. Clara never quite touched the ground. The remark might have been dismissed as the whimsy of an aging mind, had it not echoed something deeply buried, something unearthed days later, by Serena Vale, a sharp-eyed archivist with a scholar's patience and a ghost hunter's instincts. Serena had come to Hollowfield, under the pretense of cataloguing the estate's forgotten library, dust-laden, moth-guarded, untouched since the final days of the war, but what truly drew her was older, quieter, and far more elusive. Hidden within the brittle pages of a hollowed-out Odyssey, tucked behind faux spines, and the faint scent of long-dead roses, she found it a photograph, sepia-toned and water-damaged, of Clara at 16, barefoot in falling snow, her gaze lowered, as though hearing something beneath the earth, and behind her, almost too faint to see, unless one squinted, stood a tall figure blurred by motion and distance, its proportions wrong, its head turned sharply toward the lens. Alongside the photo, a cache of letters surfaced, each written in elegantly looped Latin, each signed CEH, and reeking faintly of lavender, and something more metallic, more military. The handwriting matched none in the house, but their recipient was unmistakable. Lady Annis Merrick, Clara's aunt, and the last true matriarch of Hollowfield, a woman both revered and feared in her time, who once banished every mirror from the East Wing without explanation. When Serena asked the housekeeper, Mrs. Ketteridge, about Clara, or the well in the garden, where the photograph had been taken, the old woman stiffened, her face draining of color. It was sealed after the 48th thaw, she muttered. Lady Annis said the stones shifted. Unsafe, she said. But I used to tend those grounds. That capstone, it was always dry, no moss, no lichen, like it was pretending. Compelled by a sense that something was watching, waiting, calling, Serena returned to the well, under a sky of fractured stars, lifting the heavy stone cover, with a strength born of fear and instinct. Beneath it, no water glimmered, only a spiral staircase, descending into blackness, carved cleanly into the chalk bedrock. The air that rose to meet her face was not stale as expected, but cold, metallic, and oddly expectant, like breath before a whispered name. Lantern in hand, heart pounding, Serena descended. The stair gave way to a subterranean chamber, where the ceiling arched like a cathedral, and the walls were marked with celestial diagrams, and symbols that seemed to shimmer when looked at sideways. In its center stood a cradle, ornate, ancient, untouched by dust. Within it, only two items, a violet silk ribbon, and a silver rattle inscribed with 3 letters that clanged in her skull. CMH Clara Merrick, Holloway. The birth records had lied. A child had been born here, not hidden from society, but hidden from something, not out of shame, but survival. Lady Annis's letters now read like frantic prayers rather than correspondence. Custodite Porter's Somnorum, guard the gates of dreams. On her return above ground, Serena noticed something strange. The large portrait that once hung in the grand stairwell, Clara in her blue gown beside a harp, was gone. In its place now stood a mirror, cold and cracked, the fracture running straight through the place where Clara's heart had once been rendered in oils. It cracked on its own, Mrs. Ketteridge said softly, not meeting Serena's gaze. Right when you went below. That night, Serena did not sleep peacefully. Her dreams were dark and echoing. She heard lullabies sung backward, harps with broken strings strumming of their own accord, and a child's voice repeating a word she did not know but could feel. When she awoke before dawn, shivering, her lamp extinguished, and her breath visible in the air, the violet ribbon lay folded neatly on her pillow, its silk damp and smelling faintly of stone. Something had not simply been discovered, it had been awakened. The well, the cradle, the sealed name, all parts of a memory too dangerous to forget. And as the wind howled across the moors, Serena knew one thing with bone-deep certainty. Whatever had once slept beneath Hollowfield Manor was not dreaming anymore, it was remembering. On the cusp of twilight, in the forgotten hamlet of Elmridge Hollow, where mist clung to chimney stacks like old secrets, and every weather vane pointed not with the wind, but with memory, the air held the peculiar weight of an unspoken name, Ilara Wren. It did not appear in records, nor in parish logs, and certainly not in conversation, but surfaced in the cracked voice of Sister Winifred, once matron of the Elmridge Orphan Chapel, now bedbound, and nearly blind in a hospice where the windows refused to open. She never cast a shadow, the old woman whispered to no one in particular, her voice trembling over a rosary that hung lopsided, looped twice where it once looped thrice, not even at noon, not even when the crows fled. Such a remark, strange and fractured, might have been dismissed as the rusted rambling of a woman slipping into the folds of memory, had it not coincided with the arrival of Thalia Gray, a folklore archivist, known not for the stories she told, but for the truths she uncovered, truths others had buried too deep and too carefully. Officially, Thalia had come to Elmridge to catalogue rural ecclesiastical documents. Unofficially, she followed a chain of anomalies that had begun with a single misplaced birth registry. One entry, almost faded to blankness, written in a trembling hand. Ella Ra Winforth, born during eclipse, mother listed as deceased, father contested. No surname for the father, no address, just a place, the Hollow Root Cellar, a location no map acknowledged. Curiosity drew Thalia to Blackmere House, an estate sealed since 1952, after the last of the Winforth line vanished, leaving only the housekeeper, Mr. Holt, behind to sweep cobwebs and keep the locks oiled. The villagers spoke of the place only in huddled tones of strange music heard during fog, of children waking without voices, and of mirrors that refused to reflect the moon. The manor, with its blistered shutters and staircases that creaked even when empty, concealed more than dust. Hidden in the pages of a hymnal sewn into the lining of an old surplice, Thalia found a half-burned letter, seemingly from Reverend Thorne, excommunicated in 1919 for heretical ritual practices, to a recipient whose name had been scratched out so viciously, the paper tore. The letter warned, "The girl is not possessed, she is possession." In the south wing, behind plaster painted over dozens of times, she uncovered a sealed alcove, containing only 3 items: a wooden mask carved smooth by hands that knew too much, a rusted bell without a clapper, and a child's shoe dyed black with what looked like tar, but smelt faintly of myrrh. More disturbing still were the symbols etched into the nursery wallpaper, in a pattern that only revealed itself under candlelight. An eye, always watching, a tree with its roots wrapped around a crib, and the repeated phrase in Latin, "Revertur quod numquam et," she will return, who never left. Beneath the nursery floorboards, hidden under warped oak panels, Thalia discovered a shallow cavity filled with soot and bones no larger than a robin's. There lay a silver locket containing 2 strands of hair, one red, one jet black, and an envelope marked with a date that had not yet come. When Thalia asked Mr. Holt about the date, his skin drained of color. That's when she wakes again," he murmured. "When the deal resets." That night, drawn by instinct stronger than fear, Thalia ventured deep into the Blackmere woods behind the house, and stumbled upon a sunken circle of stones. At the center, a glass basin filled with what first appeared to be water, but shimmered like oil, reflecting only the sky, never the person looking in. Inside the basin floated a lock of hair sealed in wax, etched with the initials E.W. As Thalia reached for it, the air fell completely silent, not still, but suspended, and a voice rose behind her, layered and wrong, whispering, "She was never buried, she was kept." On returning to the house, she found every mirror had turned to face the walls, and in her room, her field journal lay open to a page she had not written on. A single line in a hand she did not recognize had been added: "Ask not who birthed her, ask what was traded." From that moment, time unraveled. Clocks chimed out of sync, candles melted without flame, and her own reflection began blinking out of rhythm. The villagers, once tight-lipped, now avoided her altogether, crossing themselves at her passing. On the night the unknown date finally arrived, a knock came, once, twice, then 13 times, from inside the grandfather clock, long dead in the manor's entry hall. No one was at the door, yet outside, the snow had melted in a perfect circle, revealing earth that pulsed faintly, as though breathing. Alara's story had not been lost, it had been suppressed, entombed in ritual and silence. And now, because Thalia asked questions the house had not heard in generations, the past had begun to stir, not with rage, but with remembrance. Whatever Alara Wren had been, child, vessel, offering, it had never ended, it had only paused. And now, beneath the ticking silence of a clock that had begun to count backwards, something once banished had opened its eyes once more. The room was thick with a silence that felt earned, not accidental, as though it had absorbed decades of secrets, and now held its breath, waiting for someone worthy to hear them. Dust shimmered faintly in the last light, filtering through the diamond-paned windows of Briarhold House, settling like ancient ash upon velvet drapes and oil portraits, whose eyes seemed to follow Evelyn Hart as she moved. The hearth behind her hissed with the dying memory of flame, embers pulsing like the slowing heartbeat of something once alive. She stood before the cabinet clock, an imposing grandfather of oak and brass, that had loomed in the drawing room since before the war, perhaps before even the truth. Her breath curled faintly in the cold, though no window was open. She reached down, slow and deliberate, her fingers trailing against the carved molding, following grooves she had unknowingly traced as a child. She pressed the lower panel, and it opened, not with resistance, but with weary acceptance, as though the wood itself remembered her. There was no lock, no clatter of mechanism, only the soft exhale of air long trapped. Inside, nestled between corroded brass weights and coils of grey dust, something waited, a narrow time-worn parcel wrapped in a pale green ribbon that had once been silk, but now looked like a whisper unraveling. It was tucked too carefully to be coincidence, nestled in the hollow behind the pendulum, a space not meant for storage, but for concealment. Evelyn did not flinch, she did not smile, she did not speak. Her hand, though pale, moved with purpose, and as she drew the parcel out, it was as if time itself recoiled. It was not ornate, there was no wax seal, no aristocratic crest or flourish, just a plain envelope, yellowed and soft around the edges, as if it had aged by choice, retreating quietly from the world. On its face, in a script so delicate, it seemed to float above the paper rather than rest upon it, was written a date, April 1943, and beneath it, in a line that seemed more like a warning than a dedication, to Evelyn. When the bell stops. Her heart paused. The bell, yes, she remembered now, it had stopped 3 nights ago, without wind or reason at the precise stroke of midnight. The chimes had silenced mid-tone, the pendulum freezing in still air, and she had felt a pressure in the walls ever since, as if the house itself was holding something back. With trembling care, Evelyn unwrapped the envelope. Inside were several pages, thin and crackling at the folds, but intact. The letter was not written in haste, it bled sorrow, restraint, and something deeper, dread dressed in motherly concern. My dearest Evelyn, it began, if you are reading this, then the house has finally given you permission to remember. The words struck her like a chord played on a broken piano. The letter revealed what no one had dared speak. Not even in whispers, Evelyn had not been born alone. Her mother, Helena Hartwell, had given birth to twins. Edwin came first alive, breathing, but was declared stillborn by Dr. Lyle, a family friend. No funeral had followed, no records filed, just silence, and an empty cradle. But the truth had festered. Helena's letter told of a pact, not made in fear but necessity, with a visitor who had come during the spring floods of 1943, a stranger without a name, carrying a silver box that hummed faintly, and a mirror that never fogged, no matter how closely one breathed upon it. Her father had been dying, pneumonia, war wounds, something worse, and the doctors had given up. The visitor, Helena wrote, offered a choice, one life for another. To save her husband, she gave up Edwin. They promised he would not suffer, that he would sleep in peace, she wrote, until called. But something had changed. Recently, the letter warned, the shadows had begun moving differently, slower, watching. The grandfather clock, Helena explained, had not been made to keep time, but to hold it, to trap Edwin in stasis, never aging, never dying, never living. Folded into the letter was a silk handkerchief, containing a brittle, long-concealed document. Edwin Ambrose Hartwell, born the 12th of April 1943. Evelyn stared at the name, the date, the ink. The paper felt like it had weight beyond its fibers, like it had waited too long to be read. And then, at the very bottom of the envelope, tucked like a final breath, was a photograph. It was nearly translucent from time, but the image was clear. A young boy standing next to the very clock she had just opened, his expression calm, almost indifferent, but his eyes were unmistakable. They were hers, same shape, same color, same sadness. But behind him, the room was unfamiliar, not a memory, not a trick of angle, but a space that no longer existed. She turned the photo over, written in fading graphite, barely legible in the dimming light. "Do not open the cellar, if the bell is silent." Evelyn's chest tightened. Her mouth went dry. The bell had not broken, it had warned. Something beneath the floorboards had stirred. Something the house had kept still, until now. Edwin had not died in 1943. He had been waiting all this time, not for rescue, not for peace, but for release. The air around Winthorne Manor carried the scent of withered roses and distant rain, as if the house itself exhaled the memories it had spent a century suppressing. Jonathan Vale paused at the iron gate, its ornate vines twisted not by design, but by time, and for a moment he considered turning back. But the letter weighed heavily in his coat pocket, colder than paper should be, with ink that shimmered faintly under the moonlight, like it had been written with something older than ink. "The house remembers what the family forgot. Return before the moon wanes." No signature, no seal he recognized, and yet a voice in the pit of his memory knew it had been written for him. The manor had stood abandoned for nearly 25 years, since the night of his grandfather's death, and the strange fire that never reached the house, but scorched the gardens into silence. Inside, the door creaked open without resistance, as if expecting him, and a low groan echoed through the foyer, not from the walls, but from something deeper, older below. The portraits on the walls followed him with eyes too lifelike to be paint, and each tick of the hall clock seemed to echo with an extra heartbeat between seconds. In the drawing room, the hearth burned with no visible source, casting shadows that moved not away from the flame, but toward it, and above it hung a painting he had never seen. A woman in mourning garb, her hands clutching a mirror, her face unmistakably his own. Beneath her name, Margaret Vale, 1861, was scratched in barely visible graphite. He watches through the glass, and suddenly, Jonathan remembered childhood dreams he was never allowed to speak of a boy behind a mirror, a room with no door, and a lullaby in reverse. The sound came again, a tick, a tap, a shuffle beneath the floor, and he followed it instinctively through a corridor, long sealed behind a grandfather clock, until he reached a staircase of wet stone spiraling into cold. In the cellar, time itself seemed suspended, dust hung unmoving, air was too still to breathe, and at the center stood a basin carved from obsidian, glowing faintly from within, as if lit by a sun buried miles below. And beside it, resting on a pedestal of bone-white marble, stood the mirror, not old, not cracked, but impossibly perfect, its frame lined with symbols that shifted when not directly looked at. He reached out, and the glass didn't reflect, it responded. A child's palm met his on the other side, pale, bruised, waiting. Then the mouth moved without sound, but Jonathan knew the words. "They left me." A forgotten name thundered into his mind. Elias, a brother, a twin, a soul never spoken of, never grieved. His mother's trembling silence, the locked nursery, the blacked-out records, they were never denial, they were fear. The truth burned behind his eyes now. In the famine winter of 1893, his great-grandfather made a pact, not with God, but something older, faceless, cloaked in winter fog and bone. He gave one child each generation in exchange for health, wealth, and silence. Elias had been chosen, bound into the mirror, as a sentinel of the curse, a prisoner of the bloodline's fortune. And now, with the last heir returned and the clock's pendulum finally still, the contract demanded its close. Behind the mirror, the boy began to age, seconds ticking on his face like years, his expression shifting from sorrow to hope, to something darker. On the wall behind the pedestal, a message etched in rust: "One must stay, so the other may leave." Jonathan staggered back, heart pounding as every door upstairs slammed shut in unison. The manor had no intention of letting him walk away. The mirror shimmered again, now showing not Elias, but Jonathan, trapped within, silent and still, and the boy outside smiling. The house did not offer choice. It required balance. And as the clock struck once in a room far above, Jonathan realized with soul-crushing clarity, the house hadn't summoned him to remember the past. It had summoned him to replace it. The storm had been rumbling for hours by the time they all gathered in the drawing room of Ashcroft Hollow, that looming ancestral mansion crouched at the edge of Dartmoor, where the fog rarely lifted, and the wind whispered secrets to the ivy-covered walls, secrets that no one dared speak of aloud for over 2 decades. The room was dim, the fire crackling softly in the grate, its light casting flickering shadows that danced across portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow every breath. No one welcomed Elspeth Wren as she stepped inside, though all recognized her at once. Her resemblance to her late Aunt Cybella was ghostly, uncanny, unsettling. She did not come like a guest, but like a reckoning, clutching in her gloved hands an envelope, aged and cracking at the folds, its wax seal bearing a raven crest no longer found anywhere in the family heraldry, a sigil deliberately erased from memory, but not from truth. She stood still before them all, Thaddeus Gray in his high-backed chair, stoic and brittle, Clara with her trembling teacup, the solicitor fidgeting with his pocket watch, and the old governess Miss Temple, who hadn't spoken in 5 years. "You all believed she died in her bed," Elspeth began, her voice quiet but edged like a blade. "But Cybella did not die of fever. She died of fear, and poison, and betrayal." The silence that followed her words was absolute, suffocating, as though the house itself had drawn breath and forgotten to exhale. The great clock above the hearth ticked on, but slower now, too slow, like a heart waiting to stop. Elspeth placed the envelope on the table, and opened it with great care, revealing Cybella's final letters, hidden beneath a floorboard for years, along with a torn photograph of a child, whose face had been scorched from the paper, and a yellowed page of music, annotated in faint, slanted handwriting. She discovered the forgery, Elspeth continued, the theft of the trust, the disappearance of her son, and she knew who was behind it. Her eyes did not flinch, as they settled on Thaddeus Gray. She recorded it all, but more than that, she planned for her silence to end. She left a trail. Clara dropped her teacup then, the crash piercing the tension like a scream. Elspeth unfurled the letter slowly. She wrote, "If the clock ever chimes beyond 12, seek the nursery hearth." They all turned as the clock creaked ominously overhead. It had struck 14 chimes at midnight the previous night. No one believed it at first, until the entire village heard it echo across the moor. That wasn't an error. It was a message. Elspeth had followed the sound to the long-sealed nursery, and behind the cold fireplace, she found what Cybella had hidden, a ledger containing payments to a man who had once claimed to be the midwife, a photograph of a birth certificate, with Elspeth's name scratched out, replaced by unknown, and tucked in a velvet pouch, her father's ring. "You sold her, child," Elspeth whispered, "sent me away, made her believe I had died." Thaddeus didn't blink, but his fingers curled into the armrest like talons. "And you drugged her brandy with digitalis, slowly, so her body would falter without suspicion." Her voice quivered now, not with weakness, but with restrained fury. "But she outwitted you in the end." The chime, the cipher in her lullaby, the invisible ink on the pages, all of it pointed here, to tonight. She held up the sheet music. "The notes spell your name. You thought it was a lullaby. It was a warning." Miss Temple gave a strangled gasp, her first sound in years, as if memory had just returned with a vengeance. Thunder cracked above the roof, and the lights flickered violently, casting the room into momentary darkness. When the light returned, Thaddeus Gray had slumped forward, a hollow look in his eyes. Not denial, not defiance, but the grim, choking acceptance of a man who had finally been caught by the past, he believed buried. Elspeth turned to the constable standing quietly in the archway. He stepped forward, hand outstretched, receiving the ring, the letters, the cipher. "She did not die unheard," Elspeth murmured. "Only unheard until now." The house remembered, even if you all chose to forget. And then, as if summoned by memory itself, the great clock above struck once more. Not 12, not 13, but 14 clear, echoing chimes. The storm outside fell into a hush. It wasn't thunder that filled the silence. It was truth, heavy, sharp, and inescapable. The manor had stood undisturbed for decades, its stone face weathered by time, yet strangely untouched by consequence, like a witness too proud to speak, or a conspirator too clever to be caught. Ivy clung to its grey walls like secrets clinging to memory, and the tall windows, dulled by dust and neglect, still caught the dying light with a kind of mournful dignity. Inside, the air was thick with things unsaid, the creak of aging floorboards, the faint rustle of curtains stirred by unseen drafts, and the weight of a history that had tried so hard to erase itself. That afternoon, as the sky outside bruised toward twilight, and clouds moved slowly across a sun reluctant to set, the silence of the manor broke. Not with shouting, not with confrontation, but with the quiet unspooling of a truth long buried beneath layers of doubt and denial. Evelyn Muir stood in the very room where her mother had once whispered warnings no one had believed. She wasn't there for vengeance. She had not returned to reclaim the estate that had been stolen by forged hands and polite lies. She had come for something quieter, but far more enduring clarity. Across from her sat Mr. Redgrave, the solicitor whose signature had sealed away not only documents but destinies. His face, once composed with professional neutrality, had paled slowly through Evelyn's calm and meticulous recounting. Whether his color drained from the slow corrosion of guilt, or from the creeping realization that exposure was now inevitable, no one could quite tell. He had said nothing throughout, perhaps believing that silence might yet shield him from consequence, as it had for so many years. But silence, once pierced, does not protect, it testifies. Inspector Ward, who had listened from the edge of the hearth, arms folded and brow lowered, finally stepped forward, his voice low, as if to preserve the dignity of the moment, even as it shattered what remained of the solicitor's poise. "Mr. Redgrave," he said evenly, "you are to be taken into custody pending investigation into the matters Miss Muir has outlined." There was no outburst, no denial. Redgrave simply looked at Evelyn, just once, then lowered his gaze, as though the floor itself might offer him a way to disappear. His final words were not a protest, but a quiet collapse. "She was never meant to forgive me. Her father, what he represented, it would have torn the whole foundation apart." Evelyn watched him with no triumph in her eyes, only the quiet mourning of a woman who had waited too long for a truth too old to heal anything cleanly. She said softly, "The mistake was in thinking that silence equals agreement, or that memory can be locked away like an old drawer. It seeps through. It always does." As the door closed behind the inspector and Redgrave, it did so without echo, like the sealing of a tomb long overdue. And in the stillness that followed, the house felt changed, emptied not of people, but of illusion. The lies that had once hung in the air like smoke had been cleared by a single voice, steady and unafraid. Later, in the same room that had once decided fates with strokes of a pen, Evelyn stood beside Thomas Hale, the only friend from her childhood who had not vanished into comfort or cowardice. "Burn the annex files," she said, her voice low but certain. "Let the paper forget what the walls still remember." He nodded, though his eyes glistened with the burden of shared memory. Evelyn turned one last time toward the mantelpiece, where she placed a single iron key and a page torn from her mother's journal, dated tear-stained, and signed with initials that had been doubted for a generation. She did not linger. There was no need for farewells. Outside, the village moved differently now, more slowly, as if the revelation had shifted time's current. Shopkeepers paused mid-gesture, children hushed their games, and even the bell at the chapel tower rang half a minute late, as though mourning a truth too long denied. Evelyn walked past hedgerows slick with frost, past the cemetery where no name marked the stone she might have stopped by, and instead paused at a low patch near the edge of the wood, where winter primrose bloomed defiantly against the season. "She always said they only flower in truth," she whispered, fingers grazing the petals. And in that moment, she felt it. Not resolution, but reclamation. She had not retrieved justice from a court, but from the quiet ledger of conscience. Her father's name would never return to the family deeds, but it had returned to her, etched not in ink, but in the unwavering lines of her conviction. By the following morning, the village had returned to its rituals: the clink of milk bottles, the sound of sweeping brooms, the slow peal of the bakery's iron latch. And yet, something had changed. People spoke softer, lingered longer, and looked toward the manor with new understanding, as if recognizing that history wasn't something found in books or records, but in the breath between silences and the truth someone dares to speak aloud. In the rectory garden, Miss Caulfield knelt planting lavender, her gloves dirt-smudged, and her expression thoughtful. "They do well here," she murmured, half to herself, "though I wonder if she ever stopped long enough to enjoy them." Evelyn, seated nearby with a cup cooling beside her, replied, "Some people resist peace until they no longer need it." The garden, once decorative, now felt sacred, a reclaiming of ground where wounds had once been planted. And somewhere beyond the village, Evelyn Muir continued walking, not to return, not to escape, but because she finally could. As twilight crept gently over the crooked spires and ivy-draped chimneys of Windmere Hollow, the village seemed to hold its breath, suspended between what had been and what might now be known. The sky had turned the color of bruised lavender, tinged with threads of rust and pale gold, and the faint toll of the 12th bell slipped into the air like a closing breath. But it wasn't the bell that marked the shift. It was the silence that came after, heavy and contemplative, as though the land itself had paused to listen. Inside the old rectory, where shadows had grown long, and the fire in the hearth now cast more smoke than flame, Miss Elowen Price sat in quiet stillness by the window, her figure outlined in the amber glow of dusk, her presence calm but unignorable. Clad in dove-grey wool that matched the overcast sky, she looked less like a visitor, and more like someone the house had long been expecting. Her teacup, once steaming, stood untouched beside her on the table, its contents now as cold as the questions that had remained unanswered for decades. Elowen had come not with accusations nor threats, but with a single intention: to understand what had gone unsaid for too long. And in that soft, unwavering presence, the walls had begun to speak. She unfolded the thick, linen-textured paper once more, not because she needed to, but because touching it again made the truth feel more tangible, more anchored in the now. The seal was already broken, its edges curled slightly, and the ink had bled in places from age and hidden moisture. But nestled between its creases, like a secret deliberately preserved, lay a violet, dried, delicate and darkened to a twilight hue, but unmistakably present. Its petals were cracked at the edges, curled inward like a clenched fist, yet they retained just enough color to suggest purpose. This was not some sentimental memento. It was a message, a symbol, a final act of resistance by a woman whose voice had been erased before it could be heard. Marianne Ashcroft, forgotten sister, rightful heir, labeled as melancholic in dusty medical ledgers, had lived her last days in the East Tower, where the windows faced no road, and the door creaked closed with a kind of finality. She had not been unstable, Elowen now knew. She had been silenced. The letter itself bore no signature, but the words written inside were heavy with despair and clarity, a confession hidden not to absolve, but to bear witness. It spoke of forged documents, a will altered in candlelight, a clock wound back by trembling hands so the timing of death might align with a lie, and of a violet, pressed while still fresh, to mark the truth in secret. The 13th chime, the one no one ever dared speak of, had echoed only once, late that winter night. It hadn't told in error, it had announced a transgression, an interruption in fate. But rather than unravel the lie, the town had swallowed it whole, folding the anomaly into folklore and fear. The bell tower remained untouched ever since, its 13th chime both denied and buried. Downstairs, in the stillness of the drawing room, the housekeeper, Mrs. Fenwick, her face etched with years of restraint, sat weeping. But it was not grief that shook her frail shoulders, it was release. Elowyn had shown her the letter only moments ago, and the old woman had gasped, not in surprise, but in recognition. "I always knew," she'd whispered, "but I didn't know how to say it without being taken for mad too." For decades, she had polished the silver and drawn the curtains of a house that buried its own sins, all while carrying the weight of a truth too dangerous to breathe aloud. Elowyn placed the letter back into its envelope, then walked it slowly to the nightstand. She did not return it to her bag. It didn't belong to her. It belonged to the space where it had always waited, to the house, the story, the silence it had meant to break. She left it deliberately, like one might place a candle on a grave, not to awaken the dead, but to honor them. Outside, the wind shifted, and the ivy along the rectory walls fluttered with a new rhythm, as if something unseen had been acknowledged, and nature at last had exhaled. The moon began its slow rise over the hollow, its silver light catching the tips of the frost-touched hedges and the weathered stone of the bell tower. By morning, the village would resume. The baker would light his oven, the children would pass beneath the iron gate on their way to school, and the bell would chime again, 12 times, no more. The 13th chime would remain silent, not because it had been buried, but because it had finally been heard. And that was enough. Truth, Elowyn understood, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it speaks in symbols: a dried flower, an unsigned letter, a silence too carefully maintained. Sometimes justice is not vengeance, sometimes it's simply remembrance. As she stepped into the waiting carriage, drawn by tired horses that knew the rhythm of the road better than any map, she did not glance back at the house. Not because she lacked care, but because she knew the past no longer clung to its walls. It had been unearthed, its breath released. The violet would remain on the nightstand, a delicate emblem of defiance. And perhaps years from now, a curious hand would find it again, its petals more dust than color, and still sense the weight it carried. They would read the letter, feel the shift in the room, and understand that Windmere Hollow had once lied to itself. And that one woman, quietly, had made it remember. The 13th chime was never a myth, it was a warning, a quiet fracture in the illusion of peace, a clock's way of calling out when no one else could. And Elowyn Price had answered, not with fire, not with fury, but with understanding. And that, she knew, was the kind of justice that didn't need to echo loudly, because it stayed. If this tale of unraveling echoes and long-buried secrets stirred something within you, then step closer, become part of our circle by subscribing to the channel, so that no whisper of truth, no flicker of shadowed memory, escapes your notice. And if you felt the chill of realization, or the weight of unspoken revelations in tonight's descent into forgotten corridors and closed-door confessions, then share it with fellow seekers of the unseen, those who crave not just mystery, but meaning, not just puzzles, but presence. Because some stories aren't told loudly, they slip through cracks, they wait behind mirrors, and they speak in the language of silence. Thank you for lending your ears, your intuition, and your patience to this journey. Until next time, keep your senses sharpened, your thoughts unclouded, and remember, when a quiet room offers a sound that was never meant to be heard, don't turn away, don't dismiss it, because sometimes it's not your mind playing tricks. Sometimes, it's the past reminding you it never left. And sometimes, just sometimes, it's not the final chime that matters, it's the one no one else admits to hearing.